Hi, everyone. This is AJ Woodhams, host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war related topics. Today, I'm extremely excited to have on the show Danielle Leavitt for her new book, By the Second Spring 7 Lives in 1 Year of the War in Ukraine.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just read your bio real quick. Danielle Leavitt holds a PhD in history from Harvard University, where she has been a fellow at the Ukrainian Research Institute. She grew up in both Ukraine and the United States and currently lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Danielle, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here. I
Yeah,
appreciate being on the show.
absolutely. Thanks so much for coming on. Like I was telling you before we got rolling, I saw this book, and I'm like a lot of people, military history people included. The war in Ukraine is it's like the war of our time right now, and it's such a huge topic. So whenever I see really interesting books about Ukraine, I'm always eager to have those authors on the show. So thanks for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So my first question I like to ask people about when they come on is, what is your book about?
Yeah, well, By the Second Spring is really a story that delves far beyond the headlines. Um it's an intimate portrait of the lives of seven ordinary people caught up in the most extraordinary circumstances. We follow these seven people through the first year and a half of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And through that, we get a chance to truly see what it looks like to live daily in a brutal modern war. And these are people just like you and me. There's a middle aged man who had dreams of opening a coffee shop. Um, and he did that just 3 weeks before that coffee shop is destroyed. There's a middle aged woman, Yulia, whose leg is shattered to bits during a missile attack while she is waiting at a train station. Um, and there's a young woman who falls in love with a soldier online, moves across the country to be closer to him. We're learning about these people. We're also learning about their personal histories, their childhoods, their families, um, in order to untangle the deeper histories, the deeper historical threads between Ukraine and Russia going back to the Soviet Union and beyond, in order to gain a deeper understanding of the contextual realities of what we're seeing today.
Yeah, and this is, in my opinion, just a really unique perspective because, like you just said, life continues to go on during war. There's at one point in the book, like somebody's kid joins a metal band. Like there's, these things, and you just mentioned, people are falling in love. They're trying to do all these things while, you've got bombs falling around you, and your country's being invaded and stuff like that. And it seems to me such a unique perspective, and I'm glad this book's coming out. Now you write, or it has already come out. You write at the beginning. You have a personal connection to Ukraine. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. My family moved to Ukraine when I was 12 years old. I grew up in Utah. My parents took a job um, with the American Bar Association working on legal reform in Kyiv. And they moved our family to Kyiv in the early 2000s and began working in legal reform. And basically, we began going back and forth between the United States and Ukraine nearly every year from the early 2000s until, I was there almost every year until the full scale invasion. And it was just so hugely formative for me to kind of toggle back and forth between the United States and Ukraine as a kid, an adolescent, a teenager. And having that comparative experience going back and forth between the United States really shaped my worldview. I grew up there in many ways, and I made friends. I went to school, spent summers there, played sports.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the accounts that you have chronicled in your book. Um, First, I'm interested just in, and you do actually at the very end of the book, you acknowledge, how you came across these people, but how did you find these people? How did you get them to share their story with you?
In the first months of the war, my parents became involved in a humanitarian aid project um, that was providing aid to several hundred Ukrainian families that had been displaced. And part of what they set up, in addition to this aid project, was a space, an online space where Ukrainians could record their experiences if they wanted to in the form of a diary. And many Ukrainians responded to this very enthusiastically. They were excited to have an opportunity to record their experiences, to potentially have an outlet, to potentially have people that were interested in listening to them. Um, and I had just had a baby in the summer of 2022. And so I was often awake in the night, as you are after you have a baby. And I began reading these diaries in the middle of the night one night. And the diaries took me by surprise. They were so staggering. They were insightful and unguarded and raw and evolving over time. And as I followed them over several weeks, I was surprised to see how invested I became in certain stories, especially certain stories that people were contributing to kind of actively. And I a couple of those ended up becoming people in my book. Vitaly was one of them. And as I read over time, I started to feel like these stories somehow really matter. They're really important. Like maybe they are somehow fundamental to understanding this war at all. Somehow they're fundamental to, or central to making sense of any of this. And they're like the pulse of this conflict. And um I decided at some point I that maybe, if other people could hear these voices, it was a chance to influence potentially how those unfamiliar with Ukraine and its people might eventually come to understand this war. And to me, that felt extraordinarily imperative. And as soon as that all kind of clicked for me, I felt like um, I had to write this book. And so I ended up contacting a few of the diarists and asked if I could follow them in real time for many months. And to my surprise, even more people than I could feasibly follow agreed to be interviewed. In the end, I settled on 7 people who allowed me to correspond with them for the first and second years of this war. 4 of them I found the diary project. 3 of them were introduced to me by friends. One of them I had known since childhood. 2 of them were people that I had never met before, but were introduced to me through acquaintances, essentially.
Well, first on the project itself, I love that project because In fact, just last week, I interviewed a journalist who wrote a book, an oral history of D-Day,
Mm,
and to have like those oral history accounts of people who are like on the beaches, soldiers storming the beaches. It's so interesting to read something from like the like a primary source, like a first person perspective, because now 80 years after World War II, we all think that there was like everybody was like storming the beach, like waving an American flag in the air and just like so excited to be there to, defeat the Nazis. And then you read these accounts and you're like, oh, wow, some people were actually scared and some people
yeah,
didn't fully believe in what they were doing there. And, similarly with, a war like what's going on in Ukraine, and maybe even especially because like we're in, I would say a more, there's definitely more disinformation now than I think there was during World War II. I think that could be a fair assessment, but you can go a lot of different ways with that. Point being is in the age that we're in, I think the project itself is an extremely valuable project.
thank you.
And I love that, you had taken it a step further by following these people and chronicling them. Um, your book is so the book is divided into, so it's 1 year, but you divide it into seasons. Tell me about that choice, and then I'm curious if you could just kind of categorize um, how the war is evolving in all those different seasons.
I'm glad you picked up on that because the choice to break the book down by season was very deliberate. I feel like so much of this war has been lived seasonally, and so much of the lived experience of this war is tied directly to the experience of the seasons. And I wanted to reflect that in, the parts of the book. I mean, that kind of, it just broke down naturally basically in the interviews I was conducting with my subjects. Um and so I, I needed to structure the book somehow. And as I was talking with my subjects, this just kind of naturally emerged. Because basically what happens is, you know, in this war, it's basically like the first winter when war began, it was like everybody was just living in chaos, trying to survive. That the first, those evacuations, the initial occupations, the bombings, the displacements. The first summer was a summer of, or the first spring and summer was a spring and summer of liberations, of resettlements, then of heat. So there was counteroffensives. Um, and so much it seems, you probably know more about this than I do. I'm not a military theorist or, I'm a historian and a very human historian at that. But so much of how like military strategy operates has to do with just how like how the earth um you know basically how the earth is functioning at any given moment, right? um how
It's
malleable,
notoriously hard to fight a war in Russia during the winter, for example,
right,
is what
how
you're saying.
malleable the
Yeah,
soil is or
yeah.
whatever. um and the seasons are also weaponized. So when Russia so notoriously targets all of the energy infrastructure in the fall and winter, or I think primarily in the fall of 2022, and all of Kyiv is blacking out all of October, November, and December, and people are terrified of freezing. That was a very deliberate and targeted set of attacks, and it played on a very distinct psyche that Russians are aware of because they share it. Um, One that is terrified of cold, one that is terrified of darkness, one that is terrified of loss of power. Um, and so it was very interesting to see how seasons, how warmth, cold, light, dark, all of these things came to bear on people's experience of this war. Um, and also how it seems like especially the image of spring, the second spring, was a useful way to, um, at least the second spring, when I was attempting to end this book, you know, how do you end a book about a war that's ongoing? That's something I really wrestled with. Perhaps this was something that was gonna come up later, but I'll just jump the gun here. I decided to end at the second spring because, spring is a natural moment of optimism. I knew I needed to
That's
provide
exactly
my
what I was
reader
thinking. Yeah.
some kind of closure. Um, and following that really desperate winter when people were really scared about potentially freezing, about making it through the winter, about it was the first winter of war and nobody really knew what lay on the other side. Um, I think making it through that winter and surviving to spring was a huge triumph for them. And so by the second spring is meant to kind of insinuate, they had survived to the second spring and they can all, I don't know, they reflect we can all reflect upon who they had become up until that point or something like that. Um, Anyway, so the
Yeah. Well,
seasonality feels integral to, kind of making sense of the passing of time, the way that war, kind of like kind of imprints itself on every individual human, you know?
yeah. Well, it's such a good point that you made about weaponizing seasons. It's not something that you think about in war. Oftentimes you think about, who's got, and of course it's important in war when you've got like a superiority in technology or force or anything like that. Very important. But you don't always think about the seasons and how that impacts. The actual fighting of the war or the choice to not fight at certain times and things like that. Um, I'm curious if you wouldn't mind. So, if you could share a few accounts from when the war breaks out, right at the moment the war breaks out, from any of these seven people that you followed, just share some stories of what was going on in their life, and then what happened when Russia invaded.
Yeah. Well, one of the stories that blew me away, from moment 1 was probably uh, Vitaly, which was this middle-aged man. I mentioned him a little bit earlier, who lives in a small town, a suburb of Kyiv called Borodyanka. And he's such a character. He's someone that really kind of moved me from the beginning because he's this really classic Ukrainian man in so many ways. He's kind of macho, kind of this mix of macho and sensitive. Um, he dreamed his whole life of going to America to see the Statue of Liberty and also of owning a coffee shop.
I
And
too have dreams of one day owning a coffee shop, so that that resonated.
you really identified with him.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. And he basically, scrimped and saved all through the 90s and early 2000s to rise up out of the poverty of, the 1990s and um, rent some modest commercial space on a highway in Borodyanka and be able to open this coffee shop. And when I'm talking coffee shop, some people may be thinking it's like a swanky, fancy cafe with, I don't know, like some downtown moneyed establishment. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like corrugated metal roof. Like it is very
you're
humble.
you're not walking in and ordering like a single origin pour over.
You exactly. This is like side of the road,
Yeah.
outskirts of like this is a side of the road off a highway, suburb of Kyiv. Yeah. Um, and it's run by this man named Vitaly, who this is his life's work, and he's so proud of it, and I'm so proud of it for him. And he has uploaded onto this diary database videos of video tours of his coffee shop, and it's, a tiny little, I don't even know how, a tiny little, like 50 square feet room or something. He's got a little counter and a little deep freezer for ice cream bars and this espresso machine that's like the pride and joy of his life, and a little couch, and outside he's got little tables, and he's just so proud of it. And obviously he knows this. He opens on February 1st, 2022. And he knows what everybody's been saying, which is that, there are rumblings of a Russian invasion, and doesn't believe it, like most Ukrainians, doesn't believe it. The days pass, clientele is good, business is good. The weeks pass, business remains pretty good. He's got a pretty good business location right on the highway, so foot traffic is high. And the morning of February 4th, he, wakes up like everyone else to the realities of this invasion. And he's horrified like everybody else, but he's like, okay, I can't just leave my coffee shop. I'm not going to run away like everybody else is. So he goes to the coffee shop and he's like, well, I'm going to just serve coffee, I guess, today. So he serves coffee. I think I don't know how much he sells. He probably sells to people that are like leaving town, fleeing as fast as they can. And the next day, same thing. He goes back to the coffee shop and is, you know, business gets slower and slower. He writes, I think in the diary, or tells me later, that he's doing a back flush of the espresso machine, trying to keep it in good condition. He's like washing the floor. Um, and I'm reading this and I'm like, what kind of man goes to the coffee shop on the first day of war, and then on the second day of war, and then on the third day of war, while people are in bunkers, while people are fleeing for their lives? And this isn't a town where the war is far away. Borodyanka is being invaded. Like, Borodyanka, tanks come to Borodyanka, missiles come to Borodyanka. At some point, I think on March 1st, um, tanks roll in past his coffee shop. And I was so moved by this story. And I feel like, to understand a man like Vitaly, you have to understand just how far back his dream goes.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah, to understand a man like Vitaly,
Yeah.
who is cleaning his coffee shop as tanks roll into his town, you have to understand just how far back his dream goes, that he's telling us what his coffee shop means to him when he's cleaning the machine and going to work um, on the first day of war. And that's part of what I'm trying to accomplish in this book, by not just telling those stories on the first day of war and the second day of war and the first 6 months of war, or whatever, but telling that story plus, Vitaly in the 1990s, and Vitaly in the 1980s, and Vitaly with his father, and Vitaly with his first love, really
And
trying to contextualize these people as real people so that we can understand what the stakes are for them in this war. I think that really matters, so
yeah.
that we can understand these people as, complex human beings in a real war.
Yeah, and I too was really struck by Vitaly's story, and I was thinking about this myself, and he the reader will learn quickly in the book. But he grew up in the shadow of the collapse of the Soviet Union, where capitalism and an American type of capitalism, the American dream, that was something really to aspire to. That was like there is a light in the world now, and if you set your mind towards this particular goal, then you can have this really great life, and you can have something of your own. And to understand that mindset, I suppose, in a way, makes sense why he would still be in his coffee shop
Yeah.
the day that the war broke out, because it had been ingrained in him for so
Yeah.
long that this is kind of like the culmination of a life's work.
Yeah. There's still an ideal, there's still a dream, if I give this up, like, what is there to believe in anymore?
Yeah. Well, so your book, so your the accounts, so you just shared one outside of Kyiv, but the accounts, people are end up going all over Ukraine, in the east and the west. Talk about kind of like the journeys that some of these people make, and where they end up going.
One of the things that I really wanted to do with this book is, achieve as much as I could, kind of a cross section of modern Ukrainian society. And so I really did want this. I really did want people kind of all across Ukraine representing different age groups, different professions, different stages of life, whatever. And so, yes, I have Vitaly in Borodyanka representing kind of the Kyiv region, that experience. I have Yulia, um, who's in Konstantinivka, Ukraine, which is it's in the Donbas region, or it's in the Donetsk Oblast in the Donbas. I have Anna, who grew up in Luhansk and then was displaced in 2014, and was in Starobilsk when the war started, and then traveled immediately to Western Ukraine. I have Maria and her young son who were in Mariupol, who left Mariupol to Western Ukraine, Mukachevo. Um, then I have Tanya, a pig farmer, and her husband Victor, who were in the Kherson region, a small village just outside Kherson. And then I had um, Polina and her husband John, an American, who who began the book in Los Angeles, but then went back to Ukraine to help with some aid work, and were based basically in Lviv, but also a little bit in Kyiv. And then I follow a man named Volodymyr Shovkoshitniy, kind of as an interlude throughout the story, um, which perhaps we'll get to later in the podcast. But he's based primarily in Kyiv. One of the things that was important to me in the book is to teach, or to help inform, I guess, American readers about Ukrainian geography, if I could, because um, so much of this war is so much of understanding this war hinges on understanding the layout of Ukraine's geography. And uh, I I think that's really important for kind of just like a lay American audience. And so one of the things that I wanted to do at the beginning of each chapter, at the beginning of each section, was just have a small Ukrainian map showing the location of each
It's very
person.
helpful, by the way, as
I
somebody who
I
does
think
not
I'm really glad to
know
hear that. I thought that it
Ukrainian
would be
geography. Yeah.
helpful, mostly because I thought that just saying where someone was is like nonsense. Like, who knows where Mukachevo, Ukraine is, and who knows where, Konstantinivka, Ukraine is. And so showing just kind of spatially how people are moving helps give people a sense of what it actually means um, spatially for people to travel these distances, and then also what it means when I say, or when people say, culturally, this is what it looks like to live in this place. Culturally, this is what it looks like to live in this place. In terms of the war, this is what it looks like in this place, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'm curious if, so I think that, I mean, a lot has been written, I think, about the initial invasion for good reason, because it's kind of a very heroic story, I would say. And that, not that it overshadows some of the other stuff, but I found myself, as somebody who's read several books about the war, very interested just in kind of the difference between maybe towards the end of this year, living in Western Ukraine as opposed to living in Eastern Ukraine. I'm curious if you wouldn't mind just sharing or drawing upon a couple accounts, maybe one from Western Ukraine and one from Eastern Ukraine, and what it's like and the differences between the differences between them and living so close to the front and fighting, and maybe living a little bit further back.
Yeah. You know, I haven't lived in Ukraine during this war, so I can't say firsthand what I think the differences are. But I think both of them have experienced remarkable trauma, and very different kinds of trauma. So, people in Eastern Ukraine are kind of at the forefront of loss trauma, I would say. They have lost homes, they've lost people, like their towns have been attacked disproportionately. So they've lost, people that they know, family members, friends. Um, Many of them have lost um, just infrastructure. And then, even if they haven't lost infrastructure, they've had to flee. And so they've all been displaced. Um, People in the East have suffered enormously. And there's such an incredible uh, perfidy, I would say, when Russia's justification for this war is to protect the Russian speaking populations in Ukraine, because the Russian speaking populations of the East obviously have suffered so much more than any other population in the rest of Ukraine. That being said, the populations, primarily Ukrainian speaking populations in Western Ukraine, have suffered so much in other ways, meaning they've absorbed all of these other populations. They've been in charge of, I think, giving so disproportionately of their time, their resources, their space, their
Sure.
skills. I think that's been
W-
a lot of work, and I think that's been really hard. I think probably, I mean, I think they've been heroic, um, but I think that's really hard, and they're 3.5 years in. What do you
Yeah.
do? You know?
One of the accounts, I think it's Tanya's account, but I could be getting this wrong. She ends up in a Russian occupied town. Is that correct?
Yeah,
And I thought that was very interesting, because that's also something I don't hear too much about, is what it's like to live in a town that is occupied by Russia. We hear a lot about the fighting, but maybe not so much what comes after. Specifically, I thought it was interesting. I wrote it down, but I don't have the quote in front of me. But I'll paraphrase. But basically, it's like when a Russian soldier comes to your house in one of these occupied towns, they'll knock on the door and they'll say, we've now liberated you from the Nazi Ukrainian Kyiv regime, and if you collaborate with us, then your life will be much easier. If you don't, then consequences will follow. Uh, I think I paraphrased that
yeah,
accurately. I hope I did. Um, but I thought that was that was a very interesting perspective. Talk a little bit, if you want to talk about Tanya specifically, but talk a little bit about living in a town that's been occupied by the Russian forces. What's the day in a life for a Ukrainian living in those conditions?
Tanya's story was so fascinating for me. Obviously, I was speaking with Tanya primarily after she was liberated. We started speaking, I think, basically in December. So she was liberated in November, and then we started communicating soon after that because I don't think she could have communicated with me as openly as she did. Under occupation. But it was really interesting communicating with her when I did, because, like I write in the book, life became even more difficult for her after liberation because they were bombed relentlessly. So, she had a really difficult time keeping her phone charged, getting internet, cell service, whatever. Um, but I would say the most interesting thing, which I tried to communicate in the book, about what Tanya communicated to me, um, about the life in a village under occupation, was the way the social kind of infrastructure of the town just dissolved in many ways, or at the very least fundamentally shifted depending on who was and who was not willing to collaborate. So people that were willing to collaborate suddenly became the new primary leaders. Others who weren't willing to collaborate just kind of hid away. Nobody respected those who were willing to collaborate. Then finally, once liberation came, all of those who did collaborate were forced to basically leave. Low level collaborators became beggars, essentially. It was really interesting to see how people's willingness or unwillingness to collaborate became um, a very, very clear type of currency. And one thing that Tanya made clear is that collaboration often had to do more with desperation than anything else, either desperation or just a lack of principledness. So often people who were collaborating were people that, single mothers or destitute old women, or, people who just inherently lacked principle. But um the collaboration thing is really interesting. And I don't think there have been many people writing a lot about collaboration in Ukrainian villages, Ukrainian occupied towns.
Yeah.
Um,
And also too, after a lot of time, I think another reason why these types of accounts, while things are happening, are important is because it becomes a very uh, um, sensitive topic,
yeah,
depending on who wins. For
absolutely.
when collaboration gets introduced into the picture. So
Absolutely.
I,
So, for example,
yeah,
I mean, it is extremely sensitive. All of these people are real people. They're all presumably still alive. Like, we changed all the names of
yeah,
the collaborators for this reason because, we don't know where they are.
sure,
We, you know, have just enough identifying details about them that it could be potentially dangerous for them. I just don't,
yeah,
they collaborated, but they they deserve to be
sure.
kept safe still.
Well, before I transition to some questions about current affairs type stuff, are there any other accounts or anything else really important that you think is worth bringing up? I mean, there's a lot, and to condense that into one question, can be difficult. But what else really stood out to you in the writing of this book that you think is important for others to know?
Maybe I'll identify the interludes, if that's okay. One of the things that I chose to do is, include in between each part, I have 5 parts in the book. And in between each part, I included what I call an interlude, which is basically just a break between the primary storyline. And in this interlude, I follow the story of Volodymyr Shovkoshitniy, which takes us back in time to 1989. And we follow Shovkoshitniy in 1989 on his quest to rebury 3 Ukrainian writers, among whom is one extremely prominent Ukrainian poet named Vasyl Stus, who died in a Russian gulag in 1985. And so we're following Shovkoshitny on his journey, basically back to this Russian gulag, his attempts to get to this prison camp, to dig up the bodies, to bring them back to Kyiv, to get the bodies back into the ground, and then his experiences after the bodies are reburied, leading up to the present day. We end the book with Volodymyr in the present day, um, basically when the war begins. And I chose to include this as an interlude for a few reasons. One, because first of all, I felt like the reader needed a break from war. I felt like it was getting a little too heavy-handed here with the war story stuff. And so I felt like this was a nice way to kind of like introduce a new story. But the second thing is that, time kind of operates on many layers, many levels, I guess, in my book. And there's the time of war, and then, you know, there's also this much older time. There's the Soviet past, there's the trauma of 2014, there's the 1990s. And I wanted to um I wanted to tell this story to kind of really drive home that uh, the past, first of all, that all of my subjects kind of carry this past inside of them. And also, for me, one of the central tasks of this book was to connect all of these timelines and to really emphasize the fact that um, that February 24th, 2022 didn't come out of nowhere. That, that this is the culmination of a very long history. And so part of the purpose of these interludes um, was to accomplish that, to tell part of a much larger story. So including that story kind of allowed me to trace a lineage, not in the official like state building sense, but in terms of history and also in terms of conscience. You know, the story of Vasyl Stus, which if you read the book, readers, listeners, I guess, um, it's a story of conscience. It's a story of standing up. It's a story of um, principle, and so it allowed me to trace this lineage um, of like principled defiance. And I think what many Ukrainians consider a precedent of standing up, either quietly or not, for what matters, even when it potentially costs you everything. And that felt important to me. It's kind of like a spiritual origin story in some
Yeah.
ways.
Well, transitioning a little bit to um, current day. So I'm curious if, so obviously books, it's not like you wrote this book last week, and it's, books take a little while a few months to go to press, sometimes like a whole year. I'm curious if, so this is the first year of the war, if personally, for any of these 7 accounts, if there are any updates since you wrote the book. And then also, too, I'm just kind of curious in your overall assessment about how the war has changed since you wrote this and kind of where we stand right now.
Yeah, I think what's striking and maybe like honestly the hardest thing to accept is how many of the people in this book are still living in the exact same circumstances that we leave them in. Um, yeah, I guess I think this is probably the most difficult thing to for me personally to accept and maybe to convey to readers as well, which is that there are no not just that there are no tidy endings, there actually just isn't an ending in this story, in this book. I obviously I ended the book, provided some nice closure for the reader at the end, but the fact of the matter is all of these people are kind of still where we left them. Um Vitaly is still in Borodyanka. He has, he's still working on the coffee shop. Maria remains in Western Ukraine. There's been several POW exchanges, many just in recent weeks. Leonid has not been exchanged, although she heard recently from a recently exchanged soldier who was with Leonid that Leonid is alive. And so that's great news, obviously, although we want news of release. Um, Tanya and Victor are in Odessa. Their home has been destroyed, I believe, in Mikilske. Um, Yulia and Oleg continue to live in Dnipro. She messaged me in February of this year, so just about 3 years after she lost her leg. Um, This is so unimaginable for me. 3 years after she lost her leg, she messaged me that their home was destroyed. It's just hard to believe the like long durée of that kind of loss. And their home plays such a big role in this book. Their attachment to the home, Oleg continually going back to the home, checking on the home. She sent me photos of kind of the rubble of this house. Um, and so, yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to watch it get worse in many ways, and it's easy to crave like a narrative arc with resolution. Um, but it gives me even more respect, I guess, for the people in this book who just continue to endure and to face all of these really difficult things with a lot of humanity.
And you, as somebody who obviously studies the region, do you see politically? Do you see an end in sight?
I I see an end in sight. I'm not sure what it'll look like. I do think that there will need to be pretty aggressive negotiations, and what I will be looking for in the coming weeks and months is how involved are Ukrainians allowed to be in those negotiations, and how seriously are Ukrainians taken in those negotiations. I think something that has perplexed me and something that I think is a really big threat to kind of the stability of the region in general is this sense that this fiction that seems to have developed, which is that because Ukrainians are so proximate to the suffering, so proximate to the violence, they're like so traumatized that they're all now like too irrational to be able to make any good decisions about how to end this war or how to progress strategically. And so basically all of those decisions should be outsourced to people that are further away from the violence and the action. And I think this is a really dangerous assumption and a really dangerous fiction. Ukrainians are the only ones who have kind of a lived clarity about what's at stake in this war, kind of a lived clarity about what's really going on and what's really at stake for Ukraine and for the Western world in general. Um, and so, what I'll be watching for is how seriously Ukraine is taken at a negotiation table.
Well, Danielle, we'll leave it there. If people want to stay in touch with what you're working on, do you have a social media? Do you have a website? Where can people stay in touch with your work?
Yeah, I have a website. It's levittdanielle.com.
Okay, great. Well, Danielle Leavitt, By the Second Spring, 7 Lives in 1 Year of the War in Ukraine. Go check it out from the library. Go buy a copy. What an interesting book and some really important accounts. And Danielle, I'm really grateful for your time today.
Thanks so much, AJ. It's great to be here.